Hey class, so I decided to organize some slides to help guide you through my presentation today. I wanted to give you all a visual representation of the content that I decided to use to help explain the role that diseases played on the early human development of societies. So I hope you enjoy. Okay. Throughout the semester, we covered the development of early human societies, from the hunting and gathering stage to the growth of civilizations through agricultural transitions. We have also discussed the impact of rising complex societies from a geographical, economical, and religious standpoint, and the political structures that grew from them. To observe these political structures better, we explore the manner in which absolute rule was established and the influence of religion that helped to keep them anchored. Intellectual thought, such as Socrates and Confucius' ideologies alongside social influence, aided in these kingdoms' downfall that eventually birthed different styles of governance, such as democracy as we associate with our society today. We covered the importance of trade routes and not only being the exchange of goods, but also cultural practices, which helped to further integrate the developing societies. This past week, we revisited the environmental influences that helped to shape societies as well, and discussed the role that diseases played in the establishment. This contribution on the way human societies developed even today is the most interesting facet of world history, for me at least. From the earliest times to the present, diseases have affected human history in innumerable ways. Demographically, culturally, politically, economically, and biologically. Humans have never known a time in history when epidemics did not loom immensely. There is limitations on the scope of the influence on places such as the non-Western world and the New World before significant contact with Europeans, and this limitation can be attributed with the lack of documentation, not to prove or disprove the role of disease. We all understand that epidemics such as smallpox, the plague, and the Great Spanish Flu of 1918, to mention a few, have single-handedly massacred populations, but the real question to understanding the impact that they had on the development of early human societies is to question what managed to emerge from the ruins. Starting with the most adamant effect of diseases, demographic shifts. Populations were decimated, and in some cases completely wiped out by infectious diseases that spanned the globe throughout the course of history. The change in demographics affected economic, political strength, and cultural practices. Let's take a look at the plague. Derived from a bacterium known as Yersinia pestis, which can spread throughout the body via vector, usually being a flea, or from human-to-human contact. The bubonic plague is the most common and widely known form of this disease, in which vectors, most commonly fleas, are responsible for infecting hosts. The more virulent form being the septicemic plague, inviting the bloodstream of the infected host, usually leading to about 100% mortality rates. And then the pneumonic plague, being the third form of this infection, is transmitted through the infected droplets of a sick person's cough. All forms are deadly, and now can be understood as to why they were so catastrophic. The plague came in 3 pandemics. The first pandemic, commonly known as the Plague of Justinian, that struck the Mediterranean world between 541 and 750 BC. The second pandemic, more commonly referred to as the Black Death, as you see on the previous slide, through the 14th century, struck Europe and the Middle East beginning in 1347 to 1348 and persisted periodically right down to the 18th and 19th centuries. And then the third pandemic, which struck Asia at the turn of the 20th century, beginning in Hong Kong in 1894 and Bombay, India in 1896, and lasted down to the 1940s in India, the 1950s in Thailand, and even the 1960s in Vietnam. The plague still affects the western United States today, mostly due to the last pandemic that reached San Francisco in 1900. The Black Plague alone killed at least 20 million people, which was about 2/3 the European population at the time. With the gene pool decreasing, so did faith in religion, both because of the death of so many of the clergy and because the failure of prayer to prevent sickness and death. The economy also began to weaken. undergoing abrupt and extreme inflation. Since it was so difficult and even more so dangerous to obtain goods to trade and to produce them, the prices of goods produced locally and those imported internationally skyrocketed. Also, because of the rise in deaths, workers became exceedingly scarce, so even peasants felt the effect of the new rise in wages. The demand for people to work the land was so high that it threatened the political hierarchy structure. Serfs were no longer tied to one master, and if one left the land, another lord would instantly hire them. The lords had to make changes in order to make the jobs more profitable for the peasants. In exchange, they would be able to keep them working their lands. In general, wages outpaced prices, and the standard of living subsequently raised. As peasants obtained more power, a revolt against aristocracy erupted, setting up the stage for Western Europe to have emerging classes. This social and demographic evolution, some say, led to the Renaissance era. With the plunge in society, sadness and depression took over the majority and provoked fear of the unknown, which in a bizarre way rerouted the economic system to find its way back to a functional state. Ultimately, the question left to understand is, can a tragedy like the plague alone be the deciding factor for the change that occurred in society towards the 15th century? I'm no historian, but I do believe it was one of the many parts that contributes to why our history is so complex today. We cannot begin to understand developing societies without explaining one of the most destructive diseases in the Americas, smallpox. Smallpox had a different dynamic from the plague, in which its impact was not so much felt via its mortality rates as compared to the plague, but instead that not everyone was infected by the disease. This eradicated disease today was used as a biological warfare weapon and used in aid to colonialism and imperialism. Smallpox is caused by a virus, which is an incomplete organism, unlike bacterium, and needs to invade a host to reproduce and spread within the body. Smallpox is said to have originated as a virus prevalent in animal reservoirs that made its way to humans following the domestication of animals. The origin of smallpox is unknown. It is thought to date back to the European Empire around the 3rd century BCE, based on a smallpox-like rash found on 3 mummies. One observation of this disease to attract attention to historians was the Plague of the Athens, which was between 430 to 426 BCE, which coincided with war, and more so one-sided on mortality rates. The Spartans, who seemed immune to disease, are thought to have strategically planted the epidemic among the population as a tool of biological warfare. However, this is still a matter of debate. We see another outbreak of the plague in the Antonians, which struck the Roman Empire beginning in 165 CE, that was coincided with war again. But I would like to direct the attention of smallpox to the much controversial outbreak that occurred in the American hemisphere beginning in the early 16th century and raging through to the next century and beyond. Making its first landfall on the island of Hispaniola, today we know as the Dominican Republic in Haiti, in 1518, then making its way to the mainland of Mexico by 1520. Smallpox also arrived in Guatemala, Panama, and Ecuador in Central and South America. By the end of the century, we see it prevalent in Northern America and Brazil, aided by the slave trade of Africa. There are debates of the exact number of victims of this epidemic, mainly due to the pre-Columbian estimates of population size, which relied on inexact measures such as anecdotal testimonial evidence, archaeological artifacts, and educated guesses as to the carrying capacity of the land at the time. Mexico, for example, could have had a native population in 1519 ranging anywhere from 3 million up to 58 million, which would put its population declines by 1620 somewhere between 67 and 98%. Estimates in the 80s of South America ranged between 70 to 98%. Aside from the statistics, the Native American population decline was a tragedy. European settlers, whom were seemingly immune, used this disease to their advantage to colonize the New World by reaping havoc to what was referred to as virgin soil, wiping out nearly entire civilizations. This exchange of disease crippled the New World in defending themselves against conquest, which led to Western civilization. Europe was able to overcome the demographic stagnation imposed by the Black Death from 1348 until 1450. Native Americans, by contrast, were at a severe cultural disadvantage for doing so in the case of smallpox. The foundations in place in the existing civilizations that inhabited the New World were oppressed, and a shift in power prevailed: colonization, which is the means of our country's structure politically today. In the light of this catastrophic event, biology flourished. We see again another opportunity where there is tragedy, a shift in ideologies emerge, and in this case, the containment of smallpox. By 1768, Dr. Edward Jenner devised a vaccine that would aid in its eradication today, not only aiding the restoration of the public health, but also providing new opportunities for biological advancements that would begin to integrate into the political hierarchies of societies. This year marks the 100-year anniversary of the Great Flu Pandemic of 1918, which is another major turning point in world history. The influenza pandemic circled the globe. Most of humanity felt the effects of this strain of influenza virus. It spread following the path of its human carriers, which was along trade routes and shipping lines. Outbreaks swept through North America, Europe, Asia, Africa, Brazil, and the South Pacific. The Great War, as we know today as World War I, with this massive movement of men and armies and abroad ships, probably aided in its rapid spread and attack. The flu epidemic was caused by an H1N1 virus with genes of Aryan origin. Although there is not universal content regarding where the virus originated, it is said to be the Spanish flu because it killed 8 million people in the summer of 1918 in Spain. The flu spread worldwide from 1918 to 1919. One unusual aspect of the 1918 flu was that it struck down many previously healthy young people, a group normally resistant to this type of infectious illness, including a number of World War I servicemen. In the United States, it was first identified in military personnel in the spring of 1918. It is estimated that about 500 million people, or 1/3 of the world's population, became infected with the virus. The number of deaths was estimated to be at least 50 million worldwide and about 675,000 occurring here in the United States. The flu came in 3 waves. The first wave, first spotted in the military camp in Kansas. The flu is not contained there, leading to the spread between servicemen. The second wave was brought back to the U.S. by the war and was said to be brought through Boston's ports of trade. The virus killed 200,000 people that October in 1918 alone, surging fear among the public health. With military patients coming home from the war with battle wounds and mustard gas burns, hospital facilities and staff were taxed to the limit. This created a shortage of physicians, especially in the civilian sector, as many have been lost for service in the war. Since the medical practitioners were away with the troops, only the medical students were left to care for the ill. The shortage was further hindered by the added loss of physicians themselves to the epidemic. In the U.S., the Red Cross had to recruit more volunteers to contribute to the new case at home of fighting influenza than abroad. The pandemic affected everyone. With 1/4 of the U.S. and 1/5 of the world infected with the flu, it was impossible to escape the illness. Businesses were losing money, not only to the lack of employees working, but also ordinances that wouldn't allow stores to even hold sales, trying to prohibit the crowds that could possibly spread the virus. Funerals were even limited to 15 minutes because the fear of public health was adamant. Some towns required signed certificates to enter, and borough would not accept passengers without them. Those who ignored the flu ordinances had to pay steep fines enforced by extra officers, contributing to the rattling of the economic system. Nations were already attempting to deal with the effects and costs associated with the war alone. Propaganda campaigns, war restrictions, and rations that had been implemented by the governments. Nationalism was able to pervade as people had to accept government authority. This allowed the public health departments to easily step in and implement their restrictive measures. The war gave science great importance as governments relied on scientists at this point, now armed with the new germ theory and the development of antiseptic surgery to design vaccines to reduce mortalities of this disease and battle wounds. Then the third wave came from the winter of 1918 to the spring of 1919. The third is usually referred to as the less lethal of the three, most likely due to the world building immunity to the strain, but the flu was not done just yet. And towards the end of this pandemic, at the Versailles Peace Conference, President Woodrow Wilson collapsed. His sudden weakness and severe confusion halfway through the conference very possibly contributed to his abandonment of his principles. The result was a disastrous peace treaty, which would later contribute to the beginning of World War II. These conditions created by World War I, together with the social attitudes and ideas, led to the relatively calm response of the public in application of scientific ideas. People allowed for strict measures and the loss of freedom during the war as they submitted to the needs of the nation ahead of their own personal needs. They accepted the limitations placed by rationing and the drafting of the war, and the responses of the public health officials reflected the new allegiance to science. The medical and scientific communities had developed new theories and applied them to prevention, diagnosis, and treatment of influenza patients. The flu not only created havoc among the world, it shook the roles of power in our societies, allowing science to make its way to the top. Again, we see disease here as a part of a bigger event that, with its help, catalyzed a dynamic change that emerged new beginnings. Disease environments, however, play an important role in shaping the economic development when they affect institutional development. In particular, when two previously isolated populations come in contact, disease environments influence the balance of power between these populations and what type of institutions the more powerful imposes on the less powerful. In world history, we covered the effect of European diseases in the New World after 1492, which greatly facilitated Spanish conquest. In Europe, we observed the disease drive the power shift from peasants working the land to enjoying high political and economic classes. Lastly, we observed disease as an addition to a condition that was already on the verge of tipping an open opportunity for another power shift. These examples are just a few of the many infectious diseases that existed in history as we know today. As David Christian's take on world history, trying to understand the development of human society is first to understand concepts such as the second law of thermodynamics. That is, the tendency of all things to move from order to disorder. In order to understand the moments in history that were given these special ingredients, such as disease, with the right Goldilocks conditions, such as a world war, they all came together to create something new and even more complex. These ingredients all work to help shape human societies. Disease is just one of the universe's natural phenomena that assisted in the blending of dynamics that has worked together to develop societies as we know them today. And I think that's all I have for the role that disease played on history. Hopefully, you all have a great Christmas and a Happy New Year, and I look forward to hearing and viewing your presentations. Thank you.